But today's going to be a little bit more informal, isn't it? Last year you did a fantastic presentation. Today we're going to have a little bit more of a chat, some backwards and forwards about some of the stuff you've got going on.
Yeah, and I want to go through some pretty important things as well. I think what I didn't want to do is drown people with PowerPoint. Last year I went through quite a lot of what I call in-depth areas of private equity and why it's important to understand how that world works. Today, I want to take a slightly different angle. I want to talk about pace and speed. And I think a lot of business owners that I come across don't operate quickly enough, and they don't understand the importance of that now in business. Whereas in private equity, it was one of the key values that we work to. I want to talk about a model of transformation. So not transformation, but the idea of how you transfer an asset. And what I'm hearing a lot these days, particularly for people who are doing acquisitions, they might be buying, businesses off people who are retiring, all that sort of stuff that we hear a lot about with baby boomers and that thing, is, trying to create roll-ups and then wanting to know how they can exit those roll-ups. And the thing I'll kick off by saying is that private equity has grown so much in the last 3 years that, the figures at the moment say that if you're going to sell for an 8 or 9 figure exit, 70% of those transactions will have a private equity element to them, right? Be that investing in a strategic corporate or a private equity standalone acquisition. So you have to understand this world if you are wanting to achieve a high value exit in the future.
Yeah, wow, 70%. That's a staggeringly high.
It was 50%. And what's happened, just to jump in on that, is two things. The number of private equity firms has grown, right? I think it's up to like 6,000 or 7,000 now. Pre-COVID, it was about 4,500. Wow. And then you've got like crazy levels of capital. The figures change a lot. I think the last figure I heard was like $9 trillion. But ultimately what it means is there is money that's floating in the capital markets that needs to be deployed quickly. And that's where the opportunity is.
Got you. And we have printed an extraordinary amount of money over the last couple of years. So presumably that's helped.
Funny that. Right. Yeah. And when we say it's kind of sitting there, it's not in like a chest in a private equity firm's office. Let's be clear. It's sitting with lots of high net worth individuals who are deploying that into the private equity firms because the returns are just still astronomical. And we can touch on kind of the measurements that private equity work to today as well, because my whole kind of mission, if you like, is to expose this world of private equity to business owners so they can understand how the game is played.
I love that. That's a fantastic kind of mission statement for everything that you're doing. So I guess let's start at the beginning. So the first one was pace. Why is pace important? Why should business owners be aware of it, and how do they employ it, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll kick off with, I talked about this a little bit last year, but it's important, I think, for people who haven't heard me speak before, just to understand about how private equity operates. So I'll kind of give a kind of basic view, not of what it is, because you can kind of Google that or chat GPT it, more about what happens, right? So, and for context, I'm also aware that some people may not have heard of me before, right? So I spent over a decade in private equity. During that time, I was involved in lots of deals, over 100 deals. I was involved in 26 exits, and 3 of them were over $1 billion. And the last one was actually a big one. It was 2.3 billion in its own right. And that was a business called Ascend Learning. But in total, it's about $5 billion worth of transactions. Now, what's crazy about that is, like, it sounds like a massive number, but the reality of it is there's lots of 8-figure transactions within that. And most people who come into my world are wanting to sell their business for 8 or 9 figures. That tends to be the sweet spot. And quite frankly, if you haven't got $20 or $30 million in your bank account right now, it's a great place to start. So private equity, the concept to kick off with is value expansion. And the whole idea with private equity is to buy a business as, we used to say buy intelligently, but what we really mean is buy as low as possible. Build value. I'm very honest about this. Build value in that company over usually a maximum of like a 5-year period, but it's anywhere between 4 and 7 years on average. Mm-hmm. And then obviously liquidate that asset with a significant amount of increase in value. Okay, so that whole process is called value expansion. So buy low, sell high is the game. Okay, yeah. Important to know, right? Because if you're going to sell a business to private equity, they just want to get the asset off you as cheaply as they possibly can. with the lowest level of risk that they can. Okay, so just important to understand this, and I'll go into this in more detail a little bit later. But then it's about revenue growth. Then it's about expanding the margin, obviously making the business more efficient. Then it's about how capital is structured and deployed. So private equity love to deploy cash, if you like, or debt, certainly when money is cheap. A bit more challenging this last period of time, but certainly a few years ago that was much easier to do. Then it's obviously about acquisitions. The game plan, the book, if you like, the playbook is acquisitions. But then the last thing is multiple expansion, right? So they're the concepts. And between all of that working, right, you have a couple of different metrics that I was effectively measured against. The first one is called internal rate of return. So you may or may not have heard of that before. The simplest way to think of it is the speed at which a firm generates returns for its investors. So this is the first concept to your question, right? Like, if speed matters, why does speed matter in private equity? Because the investors want to return quickly. And the longer you hold something, unless it's growing predictably, sustainably, all those sort of things, there's higher risk. So it's a kind of in and out situation. Let's get in, let's scale it quickly, let's get out quickly. And the second metric is called MOIC, which is multiple on invested capital. And that is the multiple of the money put in times by what you take out over the hold of the asset, the hold of the business. So just to unpack that simply again, if I put in, let's say, 50 million to buy a business, I put another 50 million in to buy bolt-on acquisitions. So I put 100 million in total. In private equity terms, we would want at least a 3 times return on that, but ideally up to 5 or 6. So just work that out for a second. 100 million in, 3 times of that is $300 million. 5 times is $500 million. And we would be bonused on those 2 metrics.
Got you. That was actually going to be one of my questions, because I've heard people say before private equity want a minimum of 4 times return on their investment. And yeah, so 3 to 5.
3 to 5 is right. Yeah, but I mean, we used to joke about this. I've got a book coming out in the summer, which is called Exit for Millions. And there's a chapter in the book where I try and unpack private equity by saying, you're going to spend a night in a private members club in London. And for those who haven't been to London, there's these amazing clubs that you don't know they exist. They're like these old stately sort of homes, kind of townhouses, and secret knocks on the door and all this sort of crazy stuff. But a lot of the private equity firms have their own clubs. And I'm kind of demystifying what happens one night. I talk about it in the book. But the reality of it is, if you sell a business, let's say you buy a business, you invest in it, and you sell it for 2 times MOIC. If you go to that same club, you're going to get laughed at. Like, oh, look at that Muppet, right? That's all you could do. All you could do was turn 100 million into 200 million. I mean, what's that about, right? Again, but if you go into that club and you've got like a 7 or an 8 times or something like that, which does happen, you're like a hero. So, the very expensive, $1,000+ dollar bottles of wine come out, $10,000+ bottles of wine. So it is important to understand that, because that's the world that you're going into if you sell your company into that space.
Yeah. Absolutely. That sounds fascinating. You mentioned something interesting there as well, which is, money was cheap, debt was cheap a few years back, and obviously the world has changed. Do you see that changing anytime soon? Do you think this year we're going to start to see?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, actually, and I've got a couple of. This is just a personal opinion based on, I study the capital markets on a kind of daily basis, and I look at all sorts of things going on. So there's a massive sort of bull run, if you like, on crypto right now and things like that. It's quite interesting what's happening there. But my prediction is that US interest rates will drop probably by the 3rd, 4th quarter. That's my prediction on it, and that's kind of what I'm also hearing from my private equity colleagues. You've also got the election year, and I talk a lot about the US, even though I'm having this conversation with you from the UK. I mean, a lot of my time is spent on the US because that's where the sort of big leagues of this stuff happen. So I think that there is going to be a decrease in interest rates, which is going to make the private equity firms more confident to go out there and do deals. Because the reality of it is, 2 things have happened in the last 18 months. There've been lots of deals done for great businesses still, right? That's a given. But valuations have declined a little bit, and there have been less deals done. And I've got a couple of companies I'm working with right now that are about to go to market, because as we speak to the investment bankers, they're now saying the market is open. And my prediction is that Q1 25, onwards. That's where we're looking for a couple of businesses. That's where it's going to start to get. It won't go back to how it was as aggressive because some of the valuations were sky high, but it's still a good time to consider, going for an exit process then.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, fantastic. I've heard similar that things probably started to change a little bit in the US, and in the UK. Obviously, we generally follow suit. Not too far afterwards.
No, exactly. Well, they are quite different markets. It's quite interesting, and I find it's a cultural thing. People ask, why do I do so much work in the US? And I think there's this kind of, whether you call it the American dream or not, but this idea that I'm going to have this entrepreneurial kind of business and it's going to grow and then I can exit it and make millions and all that. There's this kind of thing. Not to say that people don't want that in the UK or other countries, but in the US it's very openly talked about, right? So it's more brash and bullish, yeah. And that sort of thing.
I've had a similar experience recently in Dubai. It's got this like palpable entrepreneurial energy.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone there feels like, it's like, how can I help you? How can we collaborate? What is the exit? What's our plan? I loved it.
It is. That's the other market that I do a lot of stuff in because I agree with you, and it's kind of unhinged a little bit. It's kind of like a lot of people. It's a melting pot of entrepreneurship. Of course, it's also becoming a much more interesting place for investment generally. Beforehand, people were worried about putting their money into the Middle East because of the various restrictions and things that were there. You put money in, can you get it out? All that sort of stuff. But it's starting to open up. In fact, I had a meeting this morning with a friend of mine who's about to move to Saudi. And, that's still quite conservative and quite traditional in its approach, but that's changing too. So it's a big question about where the kind of what I call capital centers going to be, for the type of stuff that we're doing around acquisitions. I think it is going to shift more to that. The US, people say the US is going to be less important. I can't see that happening in the next 10 years.
Yeah. We'll see what happens without a doubt. So let's say somebody, acquires their first business or second business, but they're getting started on this and they're aware or they want to exit to private equity. Should they start thinking about that speed and making those changes now, or is it best to leave that for something for the PE to do?
The best thing the best advice I can give people is to play in the slipstream of how a private equity firm is going to operate once it's taken ownership of your business. And the other thing I think, and the reason for that is, when I was in the private equity world, we have a very clear investment criteria. Right. And that changes depending on the market we're going after and the size of transaction, but it's very precise. So when we're going through assessing a business and looking at what level of risk we want to take on the valuation, right? Because remember, valuation is often a multiple of EBITDA, and the multiple is kind of subjective, right? The profit of the business is something that's created. It's measured. It's clear through a quality of earnings analysis or an audit. But the multiple is kind of where the value currently sits, but it's more about the future value of the business. Okay, so if you know that a private equity firm has a certain level of criteria, it has a certain track record in certain markets, it definitely has a playbook. And I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail today because I want to help people in terms of what they can learn from that, apply to their businesses. If you can, effectively retrofit or reverse engineer that into your business before you exit, you are going to be significantly better off. Firstly, you're going to get a transaction away, right, of a certain level, but you're probably going to hit the highest level of the multiple. And I've said this a few times on my podcast. We used to joke in the private equity firms about the prize versus the prey. Okay, and I'll just unpack that for you because it's quite interesting. It's a bit, when people hear it, they kind of go, ugh, really? It's a bit grubby, right? When we used to assess businesses, we would categorize them into those two lanes. Okay, so if you're the prey, right, you kind of don't know what the hell you're doing, right? You're coming in, you've built a decent business. So let's be clear here. It's not a bad business. It might have certain fundamentals and characteristics, but we're going to work you. We're going to work you to get that valuation to a point where you're going to say yes. And some of the strategies and techniques that we use to do that are pretty awful, right? It's partly the reason why I don't play there anymore. Okay. Mm-hmm. However, if you're the prize, right? What does that mean? That means that that's someone who understands value creation. They understand what a transferable business is. The other thing I'll say is that when a exit happens, it might be an exit for you, right? But it's not an exit of the business, right? It's a transfer of the business. And in some cases, it's a partnership, because what you're doing is you're saying, I've taken the business as far as I want to take it. I need new resources.
Mhm.
That could be capital, it could be talent, it could be other things. It's definitely going to be a strategic partner that can help you with those things. So when you're choosing to sell to private equity or anything else, you're choosing, I call it a baton pass, Ross. Like
Yeah.
I've run this part of the race. I'm now going to pass the baton on to another partner who has different skills, different resources, and they're going to take the business further forward. So again, to your question, you have to understand all this. And I think a lot of the business owners that I try and help, and certainly do help, right? They come in and they're like very naive to a lot of this. And no judgment. It's just that they haven't understood this world yet.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, we'll move probably on to the transference in a minute, which you mentioned. What are your thoughts on kind of, you mentioned sort of getting in the slipstream, but so you're reverse engineering the exit.
Yep.
Should business owners be approaching the private equity firms early on, and actually saying to them, what do you want me to create? Or what do you need to see? Or is that too obvious?
Yeah, it's more, I tell you, the way I like to approach it is build a relationship with the investment bankers.
Mm-hmm.
And so you still have a little bit of separation from, the potential acquirer. Like there is going to be a point in time where that will change. But it's funny, actually. One of the businesses I'm working with at the moment, we're counting how many approaches from private equity we're getting every day.
Wow.
At the moment, we're about 4 a day at the moment. And I said, when it gets to about 10 to 15, then you can start, laughing. But, private equity are going to go out there and they're going to try and, use my words again, prey on people who don't know what the hell they're doing. What you don't want to do is necessarily go out there and court them. You want to think of it like if you're at a disco. We're old enough to say that, aren't we? Do they still exist? A nightclub, right?
Yeah.
And, you don't want to be the person that's going up to every, hot girl or guy trying to get them to dance with you. You look like an idiot, right? You want to be the cool dude that's kind of at the back. You've got something about you, and you're just kind of navigating the situation until you're ready to take action, right?
Yeah.
That's my advice. Now, back to the investment bankers, you should be building rapport and a relationship with the investment bankers in your industry, and you should be using them to literally seek out market knowledge about timing, valuations, big players, potential deals that have fallen through. All of that information, that external information, then is going to help you when you're starting to package and position your business. And my advice to people is this process, usually the stuff that when I work with companies, it's a 12 to 36 month process before they would start a sales process that they're getting ready and prepared for that sort of journey, if you like, and that outcome.
Wow. Yeah. So this isn't a quick thing.
No, but you can do it at the same time that you're scaling the company, right? So the idea here is, and as I said, I'll take people through this in a second, is that there are 3 main areas that are important to learn, right? If you want to kind of create the highest value exit that you can. And they can run to some extent in unison, but they do have a sequential order to them as well. And I'll explain how that works.
Mm-hmm.
But the last one, the most important one in my mind, certainly if you want to sell to private equity, is this understanding the game. And it's amazing when people kind of go through that process of education and they realize, oh my God, and I'll finish by saying this on this point is, whenever I stand up and speak on stage, I'll ask, how many people here want to sell their business? And if it's a business event, of course, the whole room has got their hand up because it's the thing, right? And then I'll say, how many people have sold a business successfully? And you'll get a few people, not that many. And then I'll say, how many of you enjoyed the process? And then there's like laughter. So I know, right, that there's a big problem here that needs to be solved, because if that's the experience of pretty much everyone, I mean, there's a few people who obviously don't have that, but that has to change, in my opinion.
Definitely. And you work with different business owners and entrepreneurs as well, don't you, to get them ready?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's called exit strategy, but it's a bit more than that, because we also work on the individual, the mindset that's required. I call it the private equity mindset.
Mhm.
So it's not just about, let's improve the operation or scale here or teach, scale via acquisitions or whatever else. I mean, those things are important, but it's understanding what it takes to successfully sell into, I call them sophisticated buyers, Ross. So it's not just private equity firms. Like you've got big strategic companies, I call them strategics, and they've got great M&A people in there. And so, if you're going to go in and sell your company to someone who's bought and sold multiple businesses or does that every day for a living, you have to know exactly what that feels like. And what happens, and this is kind of the interesting thing for me, is you see the identity of the founder shift over that period of time. You see them become more confident because they're more aware. And that, in a strange way, comes out all the way through the process. Private equity can almost smell that and go, oh, wow, okay, this is different. And they like it. They like that, even though they might have to pay a bit more for the business, which is great for that founder. They like the fact that they've got someone who is going to understand their language and help them, grow the value of the business they're acquiring.
Yeah, I love that. So let's go back to some of those points you wanted to get across for the audience today. So the next one I think was transference, wasn't it?
Yeah, let me go into it. I think what I'll do now is just share a model. I was going to, and this is the only slide, guys, so don't worry, it's not death by PowerPoint. I was going to try and draw it, but that's not going to happen. So I'm going to take you through it. So you're going to see it in its entirety. And it's a framework that I developed, effectively scale to sale. I've mentioned this before because I think it's important. What are we really trying to do here? We're looking to scale the business to a point where the valuation is high enough to achieve an exit, right? That's it. But what I've done is I've tried to take the complexity of what happens in private equity to simplify it as best I possibly can, so that if a business owner has the ambition to want to create an 8 or 9 figure exit into a sophisticated buyer, they know the way that works. So I'm going to break it down. It's quite detailed in some areas, and I'll keep it as simple as possible. But I think what I wanted to do today, Ross, was make it very, very clear to anyone listening to this who have that goal, the steps, right? The steps of the journey they have to take.
Yeah, I love that.
Cool. So let me get this going here. I'm going to try and see if this works. Okay, tell me when the screen comes up.
That's it. You're on.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this. As I said, I was going to try and draw it, but we'll go through this. So what this is I said, this is an adaptation of some of the things that we would do in private equity, certainly to increase the value of a company, but also to increase the pace, those metrics that I mentioned before. There's one big distinction though. I wanted to adapt this to the audience here, right? So I wanted it to be more applicable to business owners, founders, people who have bought businesses and now want to roll up other companies and they want to kind of exit, to private equity or elsewhere. So it works from the inside out, and I'll explain each of it. And I'm going to go sort of in one direction at a time. So the goal, if you like, is a high value exit or exit for millions, which is what I say. That's the title of my book coming out. And most business owners, when I say, what do you really want to achieve? It's exiting for millions to then be able to have more freedom, to have wealth, to go and make a bigger impact in the world. So there is a kind of thing that sits behind that, but it's kind of the end of the entrepreneurial dream, right? In my opinion, right? Creating this asset that's so valuable that it changes your life and potentially changes the life of your family, right? Future generations. But if you work with me, we'll go out towards the strengthen piece to start with. Okay. And what often happens is when either private equity acquires a company, and this may be your company right now. So as I'm going through this, just apply it to kind of, your business. What we often see is what's called organized chaos. Now, the definition of organized chaos is things kind of happen, right? There's good results, but it's a bit chaotic. It's a bit messy. And quite often, from a business owner's perspective, the business owner is still stuck in the business. So I tend to work with businesses that are generating, significant EBITDA, but the business owner is still the bottleneck. Now, that's an issue. You can't sell a business if the main person is still fully entrenched in marketing, operations, sales, whatever, right? It's impossible because like as soon as I cut you a check for, 30, 40, $50 million, you ain't going to be that motivated anymore, right? And that's one of the big risks. And in private equity, swap people out all the time because that happens. So we want to go from this position of organized chaos, which most of the businesses are to some extent when they're acquired, particularly if they're the prey, back to my point. We want to move that to being a well-oiled machine. And the thing around that is it's about strengthening the foundations of the business. Okay, so I often say that you can't scale a business from poor foundations. And when people come to me and they get very excited about acquisitions and they go, oh, I want to do roll-ups, I want to do rolls. I had a call yesterday exactly about this. I was like, okay, tell me about how good your foundation is. What do you mean? Well, how well structured is your company? I don't know. Well, don't go and buy 3 or 4 other companies, because if you put them on top of what you've got, that's going to create even more chaos, right? And one of the things I was talking to Carl Allen about, I know he's speaking here this week, is, there are people out there doing, fantastic acquisitions, these fantastic deals, seller finance deals and whatever, but there's a gap in the education around how they actually scale them to create value in those businesses. And some of the businesses go backwards. Okay, so that is a risk. So if I look at strength and foundations here, and this is kind of adapting some of the private equity stuff, we have a few concepts. First concept is called talent to value. Worth a Google. It's a guy called Sandy Ogg. He created that. We used it at Blackstone when I was there. And the idea is that when you look at talent in a business, right, you don't just look at the leadership team, right? It's not about bringing in your integrator and then having a C-suite, CFO, whatever, right? That's important. But what we used to do in private equity is we looked at talent across and through the organization. So we looked at the leadership team, but then we looked at all the key points within the business that was driving the strategy and therefore driving the value. So you might have someone who's in a kind of lower level management role, but what they're doing is so technically important to the business model that we would put a ring around them and we would incentivize that person. We'd make sure that they were as well looked after as, the CEO. And I bring that up. It's an interesting concept because I think sometimes business owners, we kind of look at our leadership and we talk a lot about leadership, but we don't always look at the really interesting things that are driving the value. And a small example about this, when I was at Getty Images and we did lots of acquisitions there, we had an integrations team. It was only 6 people strong. And there was a head of integrations in that team. And he wasn't even on the kind of VP level or the SVP level. He was just like a workhorse. But we did over 40 acquisitions while I was there. So a team of 6 managed the integrations of 40 acquisitions. So you can imagine there was a very big circle around that guy, right? Because he was critical to the growth strategy of the business. So that's one. I'll go through all of them and then pause. And then Ross, if you've got any questions, we can go backwards and forwards. So the second one's pretty obvious. A lot of people think about processes, and I say, actually, you need to think about systems. Right? Processes are important, right? But you have to have a bias for systems in your business, interconnected systems, right? And ideally ones that are automated where technology is kind of making a difference. And people say to me, oh, I've got a tech business. And I say every business is a tech business, right? Like every business is using technology or should be in some ways. And a lot of the businesses that are acquired by private equity have levels of processes, and some of them are quite operationally strong, but they haven't quite shifted up the chain to systems automation. So that's an area, again, that I think business owners need to lean into and understand a bit more. And it's not as difficult as you think, right? Because it's just about having the right balance between kind of operations and technology working in your business more effectively, or having people come in to help you with that. And then the last one, again, seems obvious, but data-driven decision-making, like having metrics and KPIs and insights from that information across the business is critical. And what's also interesting here, I think, for any business owner who's looking at this and not thinking about it in the private equity lens, is that when you get this right, it actually allows you to step away from the business. So I often say the first exit that should be achieved is not the sale of a business. The first exit that should be achieved is you not having to be there, right? So you can have this business that runs without you. The trick to doing that is these 3 things.
I love that. Yeah, I think so many businesses are tied to the owner, aren't they? And you take them away and what's left over.
Yeah. And you've got to make yourself, I often say you've got to make yourself redundant. You've got to fire yourself. And if I work with a business owner, and sometimes it's interesting, sometimes the businesses I work with have got this dialed in, and actually we can move into the more scaling value phase. Most of them don't. So the first thing we work on, and that could be 6 months of activity is to make them free. And they have to be free to sell the business. But what's interesting about that is once they start to become free, they become more expansive in their thinking. And then they can think about some of the more strategic, advanced scale-up strategies. It's hard to think about those things when you're stuck in the operation all the time.
Yeah. And you mentioned technology as well. So I guess the tech is part of the scale-up, or can be. But to go back a step, do PE look at businesses that aren't tech-enabled, or is that something that's really important?
They will, but they'll have a lower valuation. So it's not to say, I mean, you can have a business that's extremely profitable. Let's say it's doing 5 million of EBITDA, right? Which is the general threshold that a lot of the mid-market and lower mid-market private equity firms start to get interested. If it hasn't got any kind of technology in it and it's still making a lot of money, it's got high cash flow, we'd still look to acquire it. But when we're doing the due diligence process, we'll be looking at ways that we can then increase that value. So all of this is about increasing value, and increasing pace. And the key thing there is we'll pay you a low amount of money for that business, right? But we know that we can get a kicker on the value. We're just not going to give you that value when we buy it. So let's assume, okay, you've nailed the foundations piece, right? You've got that dialed in, right? Then you move into obviously the scaling piece, which is critical. And I often say here that lots of businesses, when they first go into private equity, will have inconsistent growth. What we want to get them to, though, is profitable scale. And scale is really just a kind of sexy word for growth that's repeatable, predictable, and sustainable, to be frank, right? Sometimes scale gets overused. But what we're really doing here, and the key word here is profit, right? We're increasing the value of the business because we're increasing the profitability, right? Now, some businesses sell on revenue multiples. I get that. It depends on the market. But in private equity, we still want the businesses to be driving as much profit and cash flow as possible. So the way that we look at that is we look at recurring revenue. We look at bolt-on acquisitions. I'm not going to spend too long on bolt-on acquisitions because I think there's going to be plenty of people this week talking about that.
Yeah.
And then we look at margin expansion. And if I go back to recurring revenue or predictable revenue, if you have any form of recurring revenue in your business, it can be small to start with. It might only be 10% of revenue. It's going to give you a kicker on the multiple. If you can be clever about recurring revenue, and there are different ways of looking at. So like some people say it's just subscriptions, but it's much, much more than that. Like you can get recurring revenue from maintenance and support contracts, if they're applicable for your business, membership fees, licenses and royalties, leasing and rental, managed services, all those sort of things, insurance premiums if you're in that market. All of those things can be recurring revenue streams, and they increase the multiple massively. So when we buy a business, we look at the organic growth of a company, but then we look at how we can flex the model and diversify the revenue streams and make as many of those recurring as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm not going to talk about bolt-on acquisitions. I mean, the key thing there is that every private equity firm is doing buy and build, right? So if you can prove that you've done a couple of acquisitions before you sell to private equity, it's a massive tick in the box because they know that you've got the capability to execute what their growth strategy is going to be.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then margin expansion is in its own right. It's not just about cost cutting. It is about driving efficiencies across the business. But this is where you go through everything. Even things like pricing strategies, they all come out of this, right? We go through kind of every single item on the P&L and balance sheet, and we start working it. So, there is restructuring, of course. Pricing, I mentioned beforehand. Technology comes into this a bit as well. Supply chain optimization, those sort of things and talent to some extent optimization. But these are things that, if you can start to drive the efficiency of the business, you've already made it a well-oiled machine. Now you want to drive the scale through profit. That's when you start to increase the value. And this, even stopping at those 2 points, once you get those two things dialed in, you've created a high value business, and you have a business that is recognizable to private equity. And that is a massive thing because, at that point, back to my prize versus prey, you are then seen as the prize. So this is the bit that I adapted for here because I want people to hear this. This is for business owners, founders, people who kind of want to enter this game. My experience, and this is where people are going to hate me a little bit, right? I go, you know what? When you come into this world, usually the typifying comment I'd say is you're a curious amateur. right? And you're about to go and play in the big leagues, right? You're about to go and play in this world where people do this day in, day out. So we want you to move or shift from curious amateur to worthy opponent. Okay. Now, you're not going to be a master of the game, right? Like that takes years to do that. But if you're a worthy opponent, then all of a sudden there's a massive shift in respect. Okay. And that starts to do wonders for your negotiation. Okay. So in this area, you have to learn what the perfect exit process looks like. I won't go through that today, but there is a perfect exit process. You have to have the best possible team, right? Invest as much as you can on the best possible team. Investment bankers, advisors, legal, tax, best possible team. It's going to save you so much. And actually, when you get to this level, your business is going to be valuable enough that you can afford to do that as well. And then the big thing is what I call it a compelling exit story. This is more than just, hey, I want to exit my business for like 50 million bucks. This is, what is the growth of the business going to look like in the future? How is the business model going to adapt? How is cash going to get generated ongoing? And how is that going to increase? And you create a story which is so attractive of the future performance of the business, probably aligned to the vision you've created for the business, that there's an emotional change that happens between the private equity firm and you at that point. And this is the big thing I want to finish with. If you can win the emotional game, right? Because we're trained in private equity to be detached. If you can win the emotional game and you can get them wanting your business more than you want to sell it, then you've won.
It's a powerful thing for people to take away without a doubt. Okay, brilliant. Well, let's dive into some of the questions, and then I think you've got a free gift as well. You're going to give to everyone.
I have, yeah, and I'll explain that in a second. Absolutely. So yeah, let's go to some Q&A. Hopefully this is useful, guys. Let me know in the chat if you're enjoying this. As I said, my talk's probably a little bit different to some of the other ones this week. I'm getting a few claps. Oh, good. Okay, awesome. So yeah, fire away. I'll help as best I can.
Fantastic. So Adam says, what size business do you need to be for PE firms to realistically have a potential interest? And what are some of the core criteria outside of that?
Perfect. Great question. Really good question. So it is a numbers game, right? And I often say that if you want to get into the lower mid-market, you're looking at around $3 to $4 million of EBITDA. If you want to give yourself some certainty that a lower mid-market firm is going to pick you up, and depending on your industry, pay 7 times, 8 times, all the way up to say 10 or 12 times, 5 million EBITDA is the number. So just to be clear on this, if a company comes to me or a business comes to me and they're doing 1 or 2 million EBITDA, we then reverse engineer what it takes to get to 5, right? So you might say that's a doubling or 2.5 times profit, but actually when you start to unpack that, it's very doable. And all of a sudden you've created, a 40, 50, $60 million exit for yourself.
Fantastic. Love that.
What was the second part of that question, Ross? Because I know there was a second part.
It was the criteria that are wrapped around that. So we've got the size, but are there any particular criteria as well?
So the good news is what I'm going to give everyone at the end has that in it. So stick around. I'll explain it in a minute, but it is the criteria, 15 separate things that get assessed. Or I used to assess actually when acquiring a company.
Perfect. Christy says, with an acquisition via PE, does the only path for investors get a return involve the ultimate sale of the company? So is the only path to get a return because of the exit, or is there a channel for the profit to be taken along the way?
Yeah, you get disbursements that come all the way through. So if you think about it, the investor doesn't just get the exit value. Depending on how the business performs. I was involved in a business that was held for 10 years. That's a long hold. Like normally we said beforehand, it's about 5 years. In that situation, yeah, of course, when profit is allocated via distributions, you get a return on that. The big thing though is increasing that asset value. That's where the big returns. And as I said, when you look at those MOIC calculations, I mean, tell me another asset class that can do that. You can't do that in real estate. I mean, maybe a crazy Bitcoin Hail Mary, but there isn't. That's why there are more billionaires in private equity in this world of M&A than there are in any other kind of entity around.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that there are more millionaires made from property, but there are more billionaires made from private equity.
Yeah, and if you kind of study, there's I forget the figure now, there's just under 3,000 billionaires, I think it is in the world, something like that. I can't remember the figure. if you look at how many of them have made their wealth from a transaction, from M&A, it's the majority.
Yeah, makes sense. Emre says, if I acquire 70% of a company with a 3 times EBITDA and the owner retains 25%, I then follow a buy and build strategy, form a group and sell the group to PE at a 7 times multiple, say 2 million EBITDA, would the 25% stake of the owner be multiplied by 7 as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you've done that, I mean, it depends on the deal that you've negotiated, of course. But yeah, I mean, there's a point where if they own, if this is where we get into share classes and kind of how you've done the equity.
Mm-hmm.
If the equity is the same, and you can do some clever things around this, I'm not going to talk about today, right? Because it's definitely going to get me to hell, because you can do different classes of shares. But let's assume that you have the same thing. That would be one of my negotiation points, is to say, hey, listen, I bought your business for 3 times. Let's assume you did it on a seller note or something like that. If you keep your 25% in, my goal is to then sell for 7 times. So actually, you could make more money, you know, on the second exit for them, right, from the money that you leave in. And that could be a compelling negotiation point for that transaction.
Yeah, 100%. They buy into you and the journey that you're presenting, and that can definitely be powerful, can't it?
Yeah, and it happens in private equity too. So one of the things, when someone comes to me and they specifically come to me and they want to prepare their business for a private equity exit, there's a thing called 2 bites of the apple, right? Where you effectively roll over your equity. I'm sure people here know about this, have heard of it, but you know, you can sell your business once and then sell it twice if you keep your equity in the new entity that's created when your business is sold. Mm-hmm. And remember, private equity, you want to get that 3 to 5 times MOIC. So if you've got, you know, 20%, 30% of your equity in the new entity, you can get, you know, a significant kicker on that as well if you're up for that yeah. extra part of the journey.
I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but what's the record for the most amount of times someone has sold the same business?
I don't know. Oh, the ChatGPT should know that. I can tell you at Getty, we sold it 5 times. Wow. And just to kind of unpack that, because I wasn't involved in all of that. I was only there for 1 transaction, but the business had been sold to private equity. Then I came in and we sold to private equity again. Then I believe it was publicly listed. Then I think it was bought back by private equity. Don't ask me how and why that happened, right? I know the business is worth, when we sold it first time, it was worth about $1.8 billion, and it's now worth over $5 billion. And that's over 15 years. Yeah, thereabouts. So there you go. That's the only one I can comment on.
Yeah. So 5 bites of the apple.
The guy who ran that, Jonathan Klein, was one of my mentors, and he was pretty spectacular in terms of just understanding value creation. So
I love that. And I think we've got time for another question as well. So Adam says, what industries are well suited to a buy and build in the current market? What sectors would you personally focus on?
Yeah, it's the ones that are getting a lot of airplay at the moment. I am a big believer in, you know, traditional, sometimes they're called boring businesses. I don't think they're boring. I think, you know, if you look, I know HVAC's getting a huge amount at the moment, or, you know, what I call connected home services. So it's not just that. I was working with a group out of Baltimore who were in solar installation, and they were buying roofing companies. You've heard about the sort of security, landscaping, cleaning, roll-ups and things like that. I think the key thing when you're planning a roll-up strategy, right, is to look at both the vertical and horizontal integration opportunities. And what you want to do is not focus so much on, you know, the granular businesses and trying to put them all together and try and make sort of a Jekyll and Hyde thing. You want to think about what the bigger entity is, and you want to package and position that. So when I reference connected home services, there's a story that you can tell around that, right? So you start with, I want to create a connected home services group, and now I want to define what would sit under that group. So it's a different from saying, hey, I'm going to buy a HVAC business and then buy another HVAC business. The problem with that a little bit is there's a lot of people playing in that. So it's kind of what we call red ocean. And private equity like to buy something that's, you know, it's got an interesting story to it, a growth story, and they can also see what the potential is for it to go further. So for me personally, it's any businesses that are quite traditional. You know, Adam Coffey talks about this as well. You know, we collaborate on these things, you know, because you can work on the optics of those businesses, right? And he talks about a small business becomes a big business by focusing on the granular stuff. And I like that concept too. One thing I don't do is invest personally or get too involved in pure technology businesses, particularly ones that are, chasing profitability. I think the days of that are more challenged than they were, a decade ago.
Yeah, that was all of the big companies a while ago, it seems.
Yeah, and I'm involved, and Ross and I were talking about, I'm involved in testosterone replacement, peptides. So I am involved in some progressive things right now because I think there's a massive shift changing in certain markets where they're being disrupted. So I do like those areas. So I think what I would say to finish this is just kind of look at what's going on in the world. You've got to sit at that 30,000 foot view and see kind of where change is going on. And that makes a massive difference, I think, just in terms of how you start to think as this mindset of an investor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant. A couple more questions have just come in, actually, and one of them I love. Who does PE sell to?
Well, it's like the fish, right? There's always a bigger fish. So in private equity, you have tiers, right? I mentioned a couple on this. I said there's the lower mid-market, there's the mid-market, then you start to go up the chain. So when we sold Ascend Learning, we were owned by a good mid-market private equity firm called Providence out of New York. And then we sold to Blackstone. And Blackstone, L. Catterton, they're the biggest PE firms in the world. They have transactions that are in the billions. Mm-hmm. So the way to think of it is if, I'm going to get the 4 or 5 times MOIC and it's going to be $1 billion exit, from a high 8 to 9 figure exit previously, I have to firstly look at the private equity firms. What I would say here is an IPO, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, and some people, again, hate me for this, is a capital raise, right? Like if you go in an IPO business, you don't take your cash out straight away. In fact, you have to leave it in for a period of time because of all the regulations. Mm-hmm. But when you get to a business that's too big, the capital markets in their own right can't support it. The private money can't support it. That's when, the sort of public like money has to come in, and you have to then start to think about IPOs in that range. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. How many tiers are there?
There are, you kind of go into 2 levels. You've got the lower mid-market, and then you get into the upper echelons, which tend to be the high 9 into the billions range. I've counted about 5 or 6. It depends. It gets a bit muddy when you get up to the Blackstones because they've just so much, they've got so much capital in different areas, and they've got long-term funds. So we were in long-term fund 7 or something crap like that. They have these names, and long-term fund means it's such a big transaction, we're going to hold it for like a 7-year minimum. So right. It gets complex, but yeah, it's the way to think of it is most people here are going to be selling into the lower or the mid-market, which happens to be the bell curve, the top, right, where the money sits. And that's an 8 to 9 figure transaction. It goes from about 30 million all the way up to about 250 million. And then after that, like the private equity firms that buy at 250 million, of course, if they want their 4 times, they're going to be selling up to the Blackstones.
Okay, yeah, that's super helpful. And the last question then is moving slightly off topic perhaps, but earlier you said, every business is a tech business, but does AI change that? Surely AI changes the most attractive businesses. What are your personal opinions on AI?
AI is an interesting one for me. Good question. Really good, really insightful question. When I said every business is a tech business, I think, every business should be embracing technology is what I mean by that. So it's not to say that, I call businesses tech enabled because the idea is that you're using systems and automation, to my point beforehand when I went through the triangle. I think every business has to look at it from a different way. If AI can drive a greater value in your business, right? It creates an efficiency, or it creates a revenue stream, or it does something which displaces a point which can be optimized, then every business should be looking at it, right? I look at it through that lens. And then some people say, oh, AI is going to disrupt everything. I don't necessarily think it's going to disrupt everything. But again, I'm probably going to be proven wrong to some extent. I think where it's interesting, there is still a level of creativity that needs to happen to be able to get the most out of it at this stage. Now, whether that changes in the future, I know, who's the guy who started ChatGPT again? What's his name? Sam, I forget his name. Someone can put it in the chat. Apparently, there's this funny thing going on right now where they're talking about who is going to be the first one-person unicorn. Meaning that they've used AI so well that they've created a unicorn just off one employee. Yeah,
Wow.
Sam Altman. Thanks, Brad. Yes. And I think that's quite funny. There's a chat group, like a WhatsApp chat, where they're kind of betting on what that's going to look like. So, as I said, I'm probably going to be wrong, but I'll do my best to give an opinion on it.
You have the prompt engineers. That's the new term, isn't it? Or the new role.
Yeah. The one thing I think is funny though is that there's a lot of people who are now experts in AI all of a sudden. But what I would say is this: we use it in our consultancy and coaching business. I advise all of my businesses to understand it and use it in various ways. I also say don't get too obsessed or too shiny object about it as well. I think it's introduce it, enable it. If you have to employ people who have more different skills because of it, but going back to value creation, if it makes it quicker or more efficient to get to the outcome, that's where the value really sits.
Yeah, love that. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really, really enjoyed it. We'll speak backstage, of course. Hopefully, you're going to
finish. Let me give everyone the gift quickly before we finish. So I've got.
We'll send that out to everyone.
I'm going to put it up here quickly so people can have a quick look, and then we can jump off. Where are we? I'll just explain it super quick because I know we're at time. But let me just go to here again. Everyone can see my screen. So yeah, there's a QR code there if people want to kind of get a copy. So just to be clear, I did a podcast a while ago, which was called The 15 Reasons Why Your Business Won't Sell to Private Equity. And it is by far and away the most downloaded podcast from my Scale Up podcast that I've created. And there's almost 350 episodes. So what I decided to do was turn that into a bit more of a useful guide. So this booklet that we've just released, the Exit for Millions Blueprint, goes through those 15 areas. It answers that question that was there before about criteria, but I actually put a little bit of commentary in about how you can fix any of those areas. And there's also an opportunity to be able to score yourself against that as well. So it's kind of an evolution of that. So I wanted to get this created for the first time for people to get access to it, because it's helped so many people, that podcast, that this is going to be valuable as a resource for people. There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So hopefully people are scanning that now, or we'll get that out to people after the summit as well.
Perfect.
Hopefully, yeah, you'll stay around and join in some of the networking perhaps later. But if not, we'll speak to you very soon.
Awesome. It's been great. Thank you very much, Ross. And thanks everyone for your attention. And I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Take care.